Hello friends, this is Govan here. I'm going to tear religion a new one in this video, or actually all three major Abrahamic religions or monotheistic religions. And my main reasons for doing this is, once again, in the limelight is certain events that trigger my thinking on this topic. And while there's one religion in particular that is being obviously a cause of this one incident, I'm thinking of the recent incident in England with the people who identified as Islamic fundamentalists stabbing the soldier. There's definitely ongoing things all the time from both Christianity and Judaism that also is in my awareness, which continually has me ruminating and really processing what it is I'm seeing and developing my criticisms and stronger and more proficient ways, at least when it comes to my communication of them. So I'm essentially going to talk about the three major flaws to each of the three major monotheistic religions. I'm not by any means talking against the ethnicity of any of these groups, or at least the predominant ethnicity that takes part in these religions. As we saw with the London stabbing, there were very dark-skinned African Muslims that were a part of Islam that committed this atrocious and disgusting crime. So when it comes to anything like racial profiling, I'm totally against those practices when it comes to military or police enforcement. It really is about the ideas that people hold, and maybe, in my opinion, we should profile people based on their beliefs. I don't actually mean that, but I'm saying that would be more logical than basing it on their look, their ethnicity, because it's the religious fundamentalists from these groups that are causing these problems. So consider I'm Caucasian, I'll probably start with the one that people might identify me with, even though I've never been Christian, don't identify as Christian, never will, and while I have Christianity in my family's history, that doesn't mean anything for me as I stand now. So in my opinion, the number one major flaw with this belief system when it comes to harming other people, is what we're talking about, harming the world as a whole, is the straight up intolerance of different lifestyles. So we see this as a constant battle in the media. You know, Christians get lumped onto the right conservative side more or less, and the less religious tend to be more democratic, at least in the US. It's very much the same in Canada. And while I'd hesitate to label any side of the political spectrum as being exclusively one way of thinking versus the other, the Christian ideas tend to be very reserved, counter to psychological health, or what's promoting to psychological health. So this leads to suppression and tends to cause the acts that we definitely see as very unsavory and in many cases criminal. So whether it's being anti-homosexual, anti-birth control, anti-basic rights, and many of these other ongoing topics that are often discussed in the media. So if we really look at the core of religion, it's where we see that. So regardless of what all these modern sects are doing, when I'm talking about sects, I mean all the offshoots of Christianity, Catholicism, Mormonism, Church of Latter-day Saints, United Church, Anglican Church, etc., etc. While the morals and ethics of all these groups differ, they all have that same thing going for them. And we see a lot of these same morals reflected in Islamic religion as well as in Judaism, but it's a little different in the way that it's written in, I guess you could say, the New Testament, and how it's professed by its followers. It's much more openly talked about. It's much more expected of other people to fall in line with that, and people are shocked when you don't follow that way of thinking. And people go to great lengths to try and enforce that on other people by, trying to influence politics, even though we live in a secular society in the West. That's what we're supposed to have, at least. Yet we still have these groups pushing for those ideas to be made into policy, which is absolutely ridiculous considering all these ideas and policies overstep onto other people. It's not about setting something up to make your own life better and giving you more freedoms. It's about limiting the freedom of other people because they don't fall into your exact idea of what is the correct way to live life. Now let's go to the next religion, which is definitely guilty of a lot of the same things. However, if we're talking about the core of the religion, while I'm no religious scholar by any means, the Quran is a lot different in terms of what it emphasizes. For some reason, it's these fundamentalist groups that come out of Islam that are much more extreme, even though the book tends to be not quite so hardcore unless someone actually happens to be of a different faith. So it's a lot more focused on just converting people to make them Islamic or Muslim, as opposed to enforcing these individual things. Of course, there's horrendous crimes against people who are found out to be homosexual within Islamic countries, who are idolatrous. So it's the same thing applies. But what I would say is the main flaw within the Islamic ideology is the tendency to, or much more than a tendency, it's a raging habit that we need to stem the tide of, is to try and impose itself on other people to, expect them to fall into line or into lockstep with them. So that's what we see in England with this recent attack. If you look at the words that is being said on that video, that it's very much, these people who've moved into that country, I don't know what their status was, to be honest, if they were legal immigrants or not. Either way, it doesn't matter. They were recently coming to the country and they're criticizing the establishment. Whether or not I agree with the British establishment is irrelevant. It's that they're saying this is the way we do things and we're killing this guy in the street because that's what we did back home. And we expect you to do that even though we are the ones coming into your country. It seems very odd. It kind of makes me think if I was a Canadian and I went down into the US and someone bumped me and instead of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry," they said, "Excuse me." So that's just me trying to be silly with the whole Canadian-American thing and Canadians as being seen as so polite. But it's that those even tiny cultural values that are different, when we go to another country and try and impose them, even if we're moving there, personally I'm not for that, and especially when it comes in the form of religion and imposing religious ideologies, that is just not okay in a secular Western society whatsoever. Now, by all means, Christianity is guilty of that too. Missionary work is the prime example of that, of Christians going to other countries and convincing, if not in a passive way, in an active way, other people to join their cause. It's really disgusting. It's usually taking advantage of less affluent people and portraying a certain image to try and make converts. The problem with Islam is that it resorts to violence, which we see over and over again. Personally, I think the West and a lot of developed countries have a fear of standing up against that, which I think people need to overcome. There's this whole word that gets thrown around now called islamophobia, which I think is absolutely ridiculous because Islam is a religion. It's not racism. Racism would be being anti-Muslim or anti-certain groups within the Middle East, like the actual ethnicity of Middle Eastern people. I mean, if we were to use that term, I guess I am Islamophobic, but I'm also Judeophobic and I'm Christianophobic. I don't know how that word would work. But I'm anti those religions. Now, some people who throw the word Islamophobia onto people who are criticizing Islam might try to compare it to using the word homophobia or say that there's a similar reason to use those. I would definitely object to that because, one, we're talking about religion as opposed to a lifestyle that psychologically we understand as not being a choice, whereas religion is a complete choice. Yes, you're born into it and influenced by it and brought up that way, but essentially, once you reach a certain age, you have the ability and responsibility of yourself to educate yourself about the world around you, and you can make the educated choice whether you want to continue on with the beliefs that you were indoctrinated with when you were born. And we're all indoctrinated with something, some type of worldview. And that's the whole beautiful thing about growing up, is learning how to challenge that within yourself and sort of test that within yourself. So yeah, homophobia is the fear that having gay people around you might either affect you and change you into being gay, or causing someone you love to become gay, whether it's one of your children or a relative, etc., or a friend. So that's the idea behind homophobia. It's not actually being afraid of gay people. That's the thing that a lot of people criticize that word for, is that they don't quite understand what it means. Whereas Islamophobia is saying that you're afraid of people from Islam. Now that's come about from, the world stage with terrorism, etc. And that's a whole other topic. Probably will never cover on this channel. Now we can't say it's a bad thing to be afraid of that, because that's the fear that's been generated from a repeated type of act, which would be terrorism. Of course, it's logical to be afraid of something that poses you harm. Personally, I don't think it's worth the time and effort and energy to be afraid of a religion, but I think we should be cautious and aware of it and be more openly critical of it, as opposed to letting those acts affect us. And I say Judaism for last because had I started with that, people would probably be calling me anti-Semitic. Now there's two types of Jews. There's Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. They're ethnically, actually genetically different. So if we're talking about like comparing West Africans to East Africans, there's a difference in the genetic lineage, and that's something that can be analyzed and understood scientifically. So if we were talking about race, yes, those are separate races. Of course there's intermixing that goes on all the time. But if we're just, for argument's sake, talking about race, that's a totally separate topic from what we're talking about here. I'm talking about Judaism, the religion, which a lot of Jews take on. There's plenty of Jews who are atheists. There's plenty of Jews who converted to Christianity. There's plenty of Jews who converted to other religions or do and practice other things. And there's a lot of people who weren't from the Jewish ethnic background who's married into Judaism. Now, you can't convert to Judaism unless you marry someone who's Jewish, as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. Whereas the difference with Islam and Christianity is you can convert to those regardless of your ethnic origin or heritage. And by making that conversion, you're automatically saved. So what I'm going to criticize Judaism for, at its core, the religion is probably the most racist religion we have on the planet. You might think, wow, that's an intense statement to make. There's so much anti-Semitism in the world, there's so much history to anti-Semitism. It's like, yes, that's unfortunate. But I'm not going to hold back criticism for something when we're talking about the religion, when there's been a history of attack on a people. I mean, there's history of attacks on all ethnic groups, so those are awful things, but that doesn't prevent us from analyzing the cultural traditions of those groups. Within the most orthodox sort of parts of Judaism, they're so strict about your heritage that you have to go back dozens upon dozens of generations to prove you're 100% pure Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jew. And it's even more strict if you want to get into the priest caste. So at the core of this group, and at the core of the Judaic religion, their mentality is one of seeing themselves as a chosen people. It's an ethnocentricity because it is based on race. And I think that's a very scary thing. And while we don't see the media portraying, terrorist acts from Jews on other people, we can look to alternative news sources and see, sort of the behind-the-scenes stuff that's going on in Israel with the occupation of the Palestinian land. That's another can of worms. I'm not going to get too heavily into that, but there's no religion or group of people that has its hand completely clean when it comes to human rights abuses and just plain old disgusting treatment of other groups. So, in my opinion, religions cause more problems in the world than good. There's definitely good that comes from religion, but those are qualities that can be replicated without religion. I'm not an atheist, I'm not an anti-theist, I'm not even an agnostic, but I still hold a lot of the criticisms that atheists use to a high regard, because they're often so articulate, well thought out, and to the point. And there are definite problems going on connected to these three major religions. In my opinion, monotheistic religions have caused way worse things in the world than polytheistic pagan religions have. Yes, we could go back in time and talk about times when other religions that were not monotheistic were big and causing problems. But when it comes down to it, nothing has been as brutal as the monotheistic religions. We need to start criticizing them more openly. Down the road, I think the world would be a better place if these religions were wiped off the map. I love all the people from all the religions. I love the ethnicity of them. but the religions have to go.